story begins in 1929, as Newfoundland was in the grip of the Great Depression. To make matters worse, a devastating tsunami had just struck the Burin Peninsula. And so it was in that year that a small boat named the Morton entered the choppy waters of Placentia Bay. On board were two young missionaries from British Columbia, Frank Fransky and Jimmy James. They received a lukewarm reception at the first communities they visited, and then they came across the Flat Islands. As they made their approach, a fisherman came out to meet them and pilot their boat into the rocky harbor. Once they landed, they were astounded at the reception they received. Crowds of men and women came aboard the boat where the brothers played some music and gave a scriptural talk. The crowd stayed until midnight and accepted much literature. The next day, they showered the brothers with flowers as they departed. Today, we call on some of the descendants of these friendly people from Flat Islands. They now live in communities of Red Harbor and Black Duck Cove. Many are still receptive to the Kingdom message. Despite the initial interest shown by the residents of Flat Rock, it would not be until 1942 before the preaching work would resume on the Burin Peninsula. By now, the world was engulfed in World War II, and people on the Burin Peninsula needed to hear the Kingdom message and of a time when war would be no more. Once again, a small boat entered the waters of Placentia Bay. This time, the boat was aptly named the Hope Boat. On board were young Gus Barnes from Corner Brook, accompanied by Ford Prince and Bob Moss from Princeton. Since it was wartime, these faithful adventurers had their work cut out for them.
When the three young missionaries came here on the Hope, they encountered a lot of opposition. Of course, it was wartime. There was a ban on the work of Jehovah's Witnesses, and in many of the outports around this coast of the Burin Peninsula, they couldn't land. They were even met at times with people with rifles that refused to let them land. One of the problems was that they had a radio, and the rumor was that they were spies. They were sending messages back to Hitler in Germany. A lot of people actually believed that story. A notable exception to that were the people who owned the property that I'm standing on here. This was a large mercantile business owned by the Wiscombe family. And right here, to my right, there was a wharf where the Hope used to tie up. Gus told me himself in his later years that the Wiscombes were very, very kind to them. They would allow them to tie up at the wharf. They were able to get water and other provisions. As a matter of fact, they allowed their sons, who were young boys, to come down onto the Hope in the evening, and Gus would play the guitar and sing. And one of the sons, in his later years, one of the Wiscombe sons, recalled having been on the Hope when he was a young boy. There's an interesting little aside to this story. The large store that was on this open field behind me was owned by a businessman by the name of J.W. Wiscombe. In 2010, we purchased the property for the Kingdom Hall we're sitting in today from J.W. Wiscombe III. It's interesting how some things go full circle, and the role that some have played in some way in the advancement of Kingdom interests here on the Burin Peninsula.
Despite the kindness shown to the brothers on the Hope Boat by the Wiscombe family, the rumors of them being spies continued. Finally, in the fall of 1942, an incident occurred as the brothers were sailing towards the town of Epworth that helped dispel the rumors. It was a stormy day with high gales and rough seas. Suddenly, the brothers heard gunshots in the distance, signaling someone was in distress. They maneuvered the Hope Boat against the storm to go investigate. Eventually, they found a drifting boat with 13 people aboard, mostly women and children. They had gone adrift and were in grave danger of being swept out to sea. For hours, they had been crying out for help. The brothers revived them, served them hot drinks, and towed the boat into their home port of Corbin. The townspeople were truly grateful, and as word spread of the brothers' deeds, many became more receptive to the Kingdom message. The time was ripe for the truth to start taking root on the Burin Peninsula.
In 1942, a small yacht came into the harbor here in Epworth. At that time, of course, there were There were wharves and storage sheds and schooners all around the harbor at that time. The yacht was called the Hope, and on the Hope were 3 young missionaries. Gus Barnes from Corner Brook and Bob Moss and Ford Prince were 2 young missionaries from Princeton in Bonavista Vista Bay. They had come here to bring hope to the people of the Burin Peninsula. It was right in the middle of the Second World War, and people were very much in need of the hope of Jehovah's Kingdom. And so the missionaries came in here and they began to talk to some of the local people. And one of the people who showed a real interest in the message that they were proclaiming from God's Word was Eric Street. This is the home of Eric and Eva Street. In 1942, they were a young couple with a couple of young children. And it was to this home that Eric brought the young missionaries and showed them hospitality. He was very much interested in the kingdom message that they were preaching. His wife Eva was a very religious lady, but she was not very thrilled with the message or the fact that Eric had brought these strangers home. Upstairs in this home, there was a hole in the ceiling right above the stove where the heat rose to heat the upper rooms. So Eva didn't want to let on that she was interested, but she went upstairs in one of the rooms and listened through this opening in the ceiling. Now, Eva's attitude toward the truth and her role in the kingdom preaching work on the Burin Peninsula were about to change dramatically, as you're about to hear. And this home figures prominently in the kingdom preaching work, especially in the fact that many meetings were held here for many years.
The truth was now beginning to touch the hearts of some of the local inhabitants of the Burin Peninsula. However, more years would pass before Jehovah's organization would really take hold. It was in 1955 that brother and sister Johnny and Dorothy Salas were assigned to the Burin Peninsula to get the preaching work going. They set up their little one-room trailer in the town of Grand Bank and zealously set out to work. Soon, Johnny met a young carpenter named Charlie Bennett. Charlie recognized the ring of truth immediately and soon embraced the truth. Today, at age 91, Charlie, along with his wife Emily, continue to serve faithfully as members of the Marystown Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. In 1959, brother and sister Salas moved their little trailer over to the town of Epworth to further cultivate the interest in that area. Their efforts bore much fruit. In 1962, Sister Eva Street was baptized, who could still recall the word she heard through the floor those many years before. Soon, her sister-in-law, Elizabeth, accepted the truth, and then they were joined by Sister Edna Brinston. At the end of 1960, brother and sister Salas returned to St. John's. They had spent only 5 years preaching on the Burin Peninsula, yet to this day, many older residents still speak of them fondly. They continued busy in Jehovah's service and remained faithful to the very end. In 1961, 2 young special pioneers were assigned to pick up the work where Johnny and Dorothy had left off, Brother Max Powell and Brother Frank Abbott. The 2 brothers moved into the Salas' old trailer in Epworth and started preaching. The following year, they had an interesting visit from a young brother we know quite well.
They had a little one-room trailer. In the late 50s, the little trailer was moved over here to Epworth, and the pickup truck behind me sits on the spot where that little trailer used to be. The meetings, they started having the meetings here in Epworth at that time, here in the little trailer. In 1962, I had just turned 14, and I had the privilege of coming here and spending the summer pioneering with Max Powell and Frank Abbott, living in that little trailer on this site. Unknown to me at the time, right across the road from here, there were 2 young girls about my own age. Today, they're Sister Helen Hawes and Sister Peggy Street, who are publishers in our congregation.
In 1963, Max Powell married his wife Iris, and Brother Abbott was sent to Botwood. By the end of that year, Max and Iris would be reassigned to the Shoal Harbor congregation. Today they continue serving faithfully in St. John's. Imagine how Brother Powell must have felt in 2010 when he returned to the Burin Peninsula to assist in the construction of this beautiful Kingdom Hall.
In 1964, Brother and Sister Powell were reassigned from the Burin Peninsula, and so the work then was carried on by the local sisters. Sister Eva Street conducted the meetings at their home here in Epworth, and the meetings were attended by Sister Elizabeth Street and her children, and Sister Edna Brinston and her children. And some limited preaching was done by these faithful sisters during that 5-year period as well, until 1969 when the Holloways and Bridles moved here to serve where the need is greater.
Meanwhile, in 1966, Brother and Sister John and Vivian Hodgson were assigned to serve as special pioneers over in the town of Grand Bank. They purchased a small house on Elizabeth Avenue and began to hold meetings there. Before long, they met Sister Diane Strickland, who had been introduced to the truth by her mother as a teenager at her home on Random Island. With renewed interest, Diane witnessed to her sister-in-law Edna, and in 1974, both of them got baptized. In 1983, John and Vivian had to leave Grand Bank due to deteriorating health. Ever since that time, our faithful brothers and sisters living in the Grand Bank Fortune area have been driving 45 minutes each way to regularly attend the congregation meetings in Marystown. In the fall of 1969, Brother and Sister Clayton and Gertie Holloway, along with their daughter, Belinda, moved from St. John's to Marystown to serve where the need was greater. They were joined by Brother and Sister Lloyd and Frankie Bridle and their sons Harvey and Alan. Brother Bridle soon entered into the regular pioneer work. The following year, Brother and Sister Boyd and Judy Holloway were married and invited to serve as pioneers in Marystown.
In the summer of 1970, and a week later, we came here to our pioneer assignment, and we lived here at 85 Smallwood Crescent. We lived here for 3 years, and during that a couple of those years, the Tuesday night meeting was held here in our kitchen. We had the Sunday meeting in Epworth at the Streets home, and the Tuesday night meeting was held here at 85 Smallwood Crescent.
The 1970s were a time of great expansion in our congregation. First to progress to baptism was Sister Frances Brake, who had been in contact with the truth as a child while living in Nova Scotia. Sister Elizabeth Street had started calling on Sister Brake in 1969, and in 1972 she symbolized her dedication to Jehovah with baptism. Shortly thereafter, a young man with a real hunger for spiritual things was contacted with the Kingdom message. His name was Steve Dalton, and he had been heavily involved with the Pentecostal Church. At first he had difficulty accepting certain truths because they were so different from what he had been taught. But then one night, as he was reading his truth book, he excitedly jumped up out of bed and announced to his wife Faye, "I have found the truth." Needless to say, Brother Dalton and his young family made rapid progress. Next came along a young man who was a well-known radio personality known as Gentleman Jim. In 1973, Brother Holloway called on Jim and Betty Walsh at their takeout in Creston North. After a 2-hour conversation, Jim told Boyd that he would probably become his spiritual brother. His prediction soon proved true when he and his wife Betty were baptized. Once Jehovah decides to speed up the work, there's no stopping his powerful Holy Spirit. This became evident when a young man named Clarence Hawes, who was working as a security guard at the local mall, found a book in the garbage can. The book was entitled God's Eternal Purpose, and it contained some very deep scriptural truths. Clarence eagerly read the book from cover to cover and recognized the ring of truth right away. But he had no idea who the publishers of the book were. His wife Helen, being from the town of Epworth, was well acquainted with the work of Jehovah's Witnesses. At Clarence's urging, she contacted Sister Eva Street, who then called Brother Boyd Holloway. Within 20 minutes of receiving the call, Boyd was at the mall to make contact with Clarence. Clarence was shocked to discover that the book that he had read was published by Jehovah's Witnesses. However, he made very rapid progress. At first, Helen was opposed to the stand Clarence had taken for true worship, but in time, Clarence's entire family was united in their worship of Jehovah. Of course, by this time, the congregation had outgrown the Street's home in Epworth and Boyd's apartment on Smallwood Crescent. The congregation needed a Kingdom Hall.
I'm standing at an intersection in Crescent South. Just to my right used to be Wiscombe Motors, a local Ford dealer. Just about in this spot where I'm standing, in 1971, Brother Lloyd Bridle, Brother Holloway Clayton, and myself came up here and we started to put in a foundation for a new Kingdom Hall. The town council stopped our project because they said there was going to be a highway built here. Of course, the highway is here today.
Since the plans to build a Kingdom Hall fell through, the brothers decided to purchase the old Lions Club building on Marine Drive. In 1978, the brothers undertook a monumental task. To make more room for parking, they decided to move the building back from the road by about 25 feet. They also decided they would dig a basement that could serve as a pioneer apartment. The 1980s saw a new generation growing up in the truth as the young families that came into the truth in the 70s continued to grow. By the mid-1980s, the congregation welcomed brother and sister Ed and Mary Beth Dye, who had been assigned to serve as special pioneers. The years that followed saw another time of expansion in our congregation, as Sister Lindsay Wiscombe, Donna Shears, Donna Harrett, and Corwin Cornish joined our ranks. Brother and Sister Dye also studied with a well-known fishing boat skipper named Ted Taylor. Brother Taylor soon became a bold and zealous kingdom proclaimer. He now serves as an elder, along with his wife Dorothy, in the Hubbards congregation in Nova Scotia. As the years passed, scores of brothers and sisters would pass through the doors of our old Kingdom Hall on Marine Drive. We had renovated the building several times, and finally in 2009, the need for a new Kingdom Hall was identified, and the building was sold. For the next year and a half, while preparations were being made for the new Kingdom Hall, we met in the basement of the old J.W. Wiscombe building in Creston South. There we learned quite literally how to serve Jehovah shoulder to shoulder. And then our dreams came true. With Jehovah's blessing and the incredible outpouring of support from our spiritual family across the island, this beautiful new house of worship was built to Jehovah's praise in 2010. But our story is far from over. No, the book of the history of the Marystown Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses is just getting started. We look forward to seeing many more join us in our worship of Jehovah in the time remaining in this old world. And how we look forward to the day when we can welcome back all of our friends that have shared in the establishment of our congregation. We will never forget all those that have shared in the planting and watering of the seeds of kingdom truth on the Burin Peninsula. But of course, all praise must go to the one who made it grow, our great God, Jehovah.